Hello, I'm Dina Ocampo from the UP College of Education. This presentation is about family literacy and society. The outline of this talk includes literacy, family literacy programs, and some research. First, let's think about literacy. What immediately comes to your mind when you hear the term literacy? What are the types of literacies which you have encountered? How have these literacies come about? Oftentimes, the words that we associated with literacy are read, write, compute, solve problems. But when you come to think of it, it's not really clear or it's not stated whether these skills refer to a purpose for using literacy. In 2004, the UNESCO released a definition of literacy. Literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, compute, and use printed and written materials associated with varying contexts. Literacy involves a continuum of learning in enabling individuals to achieve their goals, to develop their knowledge and potential, and to participate fully in their community and wider society. This definition of literacy already incorporated concepts and abilities that are way beyond reading and writing. Of course, these remain to be included, but these are now beyond reading and writing because now the purpose is clear that you must communicate, interpret, create, use. And then the individual's purpose is already included in the definition. In other words, literacy is not just a skill, it is also a tool. This definition of literacy has been used as the basis for functional literacy definitions in the Philippines. Recently, the UNESCO updated its definition. It states, beyond its conventional concept as a set of reading, writing, and counting skills, literacy is now understood as a means of identification, understanding, interpretation, creation, and communication in an increasingly digital, text-mediated, information-rich, and fast-changing world. So this has now included other kinds of text. So the first evolution was including the purpose and the agency of the person. This present iteration now includes the various texts that readers and writers engage with. This is an important distinction because as the world changes, what children read or what we adults read change as well. And the abilities or the skills that we apply to these texts are different and used in different ways. What are the skills we need? 21st century competences are the following. And these are just a few because there are many, many more lists out there. Communication skills, decision making, intrapersonal, interpersonal skills, lifelong learning skills, critical thinking skills, creativity, and the use of information and communication technology is also considered a skill. But again, but importantly, we must think that none of these competences are subject specific. In other words, these skills that are related to 21st century, these these skills are applicable in any domain, in any subject area, in any life situation. And so literacy has evolved so that you can now use these literacies for different contexts, for different requirements, for different needs, and for different purposes. In the world we are working in now, these competences seem to be premium and allow us to enter into different work situations, employment or entrepreneurial situations, as well as aesthetic engagements. If we are better able to think critically and creatively, we are also better able to appreciate the art forms that are created by others. We are also able to engage with the science that is produced by academics or researchers. So it's very important for us to understand that these competences allow us to move from one universe to the other or one domain to another. Now, family literacy naturally uses the definitions of literacy that we had discussed before. So has been a change in the way family literacy has been constructed. When the term was first used in around 1983 through a research by Taylor, the family became a site for literacy. This was done by doing a phenomenological or ethnographic study with 6 families. But then we have to remember that this is drawn from the theoretical propositions of Vygotsky, Bronfenbrenner. They say that much of learning is social and that the bioecological systems or the systems where children and adults move, these interact and these allow us to engage in bigger and bigger environments or groups of people or worlds even because we are able to navigate them using our competencies. Freire also brought in the point of critical literacy as an unnecessary ability so that we can be liberated from the trappings of somebody else's control. But he also told us that we have to be careful to be mindful and cognizant of the times when literacy is used to perpetuate inequalities. So these points of view have impinged on the way family literacy has been defined and constructed. So the evolving understanding of family literacy is an important aspect or thing to think about. For example, in the beginning of its construction of family literacy or understanding, it was really a parent providing help for a child learning to read or write. So it's something intergenerational with an adult providing the support for a child. Later on, studies came about showing that siblings actually sometimes play an even more important or more significant role in supporting learning among other siblings so that children supporting children or peers supporting peers has also been emphasized as part of family literacy. So it's not just adult to child, it can be child to child. So the scaffolding by an adult is not always the case in family literacy. In fact, some research has shown that children actually scaffold so that adults learn to become more literate. This is very, very observable in situations where there is low literacy levels in a community. So that children who go to school are able to teach their parents how to read, or when they bring home their reading materials, their parents have to practice their reading because oftentimes literacy practice or the times that we use our literacy is is minimal, but because children bring home materials from school, parents engage with these materials so that they can help their children. And so they are given opportunities to practice their literacy. And so the scaffolding is not always by an adult. Sometimes it is by a child. the family structure also affects how literacy learning occurs. For example, one of the studies in Bangladesh showed that in highly communal homes where several families live, like um, with grandparents or with uncles and aunties, people contribute to the family economically. And when they do, those who are working have a role to play, and those who stay home with the young ones are the ones who actually facilitate interaction with reading material or doing their homework or helping them read. And so the family structure actually um, dictates how literacies are are happening, or literacy behaviors are happening in the home. So if the parents are the ones working and maybe the grandparents are the ones at home, then they are the ones who are engaging with the children. Sometimes when all adults are out working, then children help children. The family structure is an important element because these these structures are one of the variables or factors that differentiate how family literacy happens in different communities and different countries. The construction of meaning should also take into account what we normally would say are not important. For example, in family literacy, what has been emphasized is that it should be interactive, you know. Um, but it has been found, especially in communities of indigenous peoples or low income communities, or communities where families have low education attainment. um, it seems that memorization, repetition, or group recitation have some value, because I think this is where they first demonstrate that they are able to read and write, but more read. So if a child is able to read the phrase and then repeat it, memorize a phrase, some communities actually think that is a significant step towards becoming more creative in their use of literacies. So, whilst in some societies, memorization is frowned upon, in other societies, it is of value. And therefore, it is very important, therefore, to be able to understand what is important in certain communities. And that these values that are given for literacy behaviors, these must be respected, because that's what the families and communities use as stepping stones to the next levels of literacy that they want to attain. The sixth point in understanding family literacy is that the way a family constructs literacy or defines literacy affects their practices. For example, if a family believes that everyone must be literate because they need to study and read the Quran, then the family will put premium on reading Arabic. And so, how the family defines literacy, for example, if it is viewed as the language of their faith, then the value of literacy in Arabic becomes the number one consideration for this family. And so, children are encouraged to learn this language and to learn literacy in that language. For example, if literacy is now seen as a language of school, then families will pay more attention to the materials from school and the language used in school. So it's very important to be able to understand what attributions families give to literacy. It's very important also to see whether these literacies help the family strengthen their identities and aspirations. In another research, and we're still working on publishing it, home, school, and community partnerships are very important. For example, a readership program that was begun in school filtered towards the community because that was the way it was designed. And through community intervention and through community partnerships, homes were brought in so that the readership program could prosper. For example, a school would lend out storybooks so that families and meaning adults in the families and other children in the families could read together. They could also practice alphabets together or phonological awareness together. But it came from school, but it did not send out literacy materials as if they were homework. They sent them out so that people would enjoy stories and books. And finally, one of the more recent publications on family literacy showed that there are four main factors that affect the family literacy behaviors in school in homes. One is language. So if the family finds material in the language that they speak, then they read together. Or if the family likes to learn a language better, then they find materials with that language. Home strength and activities is also important. The more cohesive family life is, the more they do things together. And these things include literacy activities. Faith, values, and aspirations also drive literacy behavior as well as the home and school connection, which we have already discussed earlier. Family literacy behaviors in the beginning of the construction of family literacy theory looked at shared book reading as central to the family literacy situation. And they looked at shared book reading as a way to promote, um, to, to help the development of early literacy achievements among young children. Included in such behaviors, for example, is storytelling. Families that talk together tend to develop children who are easy or fall quite easily into literacy practice. Oral language is an important basis for literacy. So the more families engage with each other, the more likely they will also engage with stories and books. But you see, in some cultures, books are not available. So rather than looking at shared book reading, researchers have found that literacy behaviors include reading events. For example, they read a poster, or they read an announcement, or they read their mobile phones. These are reading events. And so the more they engage with the carriers of written material, the more reading practice they get. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a book, but it has to be reading events. However, if coupled with book reading, what is shown is that children who are familiar with books also develop what is called book knowledge. And so if they have more experience with books, they also naturally have more experience with more formal language constructions that are usually present in the stories and the books and the material that they will meet in school. So book talk, book language, book knowledge still becomes important, but it is not central all the time. Apparently, the construction of shared book reading was really an experience that was derived from Western societies. But when research on Asian, African, South American societies arrived or were conducted on family literacy, it was found that the interactions about literacy were really more functional. And so it was very important to think about whether these functional interactions were sufficient to 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 foster encouragement and motivation and positive attitudes towards reading and writing. When they indeed many of them found that they were good reading events and that they were significant to family life. And therefore, it's important to see that family literacy behaviors are not just is not something that is monolithic, that there's only one way to do it, but rather there are many ways to do it. And finally, what seems to be pervading all over the world in the last 15, 20 years are new literacies that have to do with technology. And this is an area where, because of the development of mobile technology, this area has been thought that it will drive literacies even more towards the individual level. But more and more, the technologies are becoming collaborative, and sharing is becoming a part of our language. When we say share, we actually mean we share on social media or we share over email. And so these new literacies allow families to interact also on using literacy skills. So I think that the way literacy behaviors are manifested or observed in families is also changing. And as these change, the family literacy theory also changes. In 2001, Malu Doronila, who was our mentor and as colleague here at the College of Education, wrote about the literate tradition in 6 marginal communities in the Philippines and investigated and analyzed the interrelations of literacy, education, and social development. She posited 5 main ideas. First, literacy in everyday life is observable, is valued, and must be propagated. Adult literacy develops based on function and need. So if we create more need for adults to use their literacy abilities, then their literacy will develop. Many times after an adult leaves schools and works in the farm, literacy necessity becomes lower. What is important is to provide more opportunities to use their literacy. The more literacy is needed in community life, the more people in the community will use literacy and demonstrate literacy behaviors. Fourth, literacy can be developed by learning from life. In other words, if there is a scribe in the community, then that scribe can actually write down experiences of the community and the others can read about it. But literacy, reading about prescriptions, reading about religious materials or reading religious materials in church, engaging with children and their homework, attending town hall meetings or barangay meetings, all of these will encourage the use of literacy. And finally, cultural and social knowledge are important to literacy learning. The more um, relevant and contextualized materials and reading materials are to a culture, to a community, the more likely it will be understood. And of course, the more likely it will be read. Some examples of family literacy programs are farmer scientist programs. I had the pleasure of joining research and advocacy activities for this purpose. For example, um, while the agriculture scientists would be helping farmers with their crops, we would be observing and we would note down which of the farmers were not holding a pencil or ball pen and a notebook so they could take down notes. We would then investigate whether these farmers were the ones who needed some literacy lessons, and we would go to their homes and teach them literacy individually if they agreed. Sometimes what we would do was to put it in the guise of providing them with materials about their farmer scientist program, and then we would start there and slowly teach them about letters and sounds and putting together these sounds and getting these sounds using relevant words. So for example, at that time what we did was, if we were working with farmers, then we would use the word lupa. And with the word lupa, you have four letters. And we would break apart this word lupa into two syllables. And every syllable we will break up into sounds. And then we would teach the farmer these sounds. And then we would jumble up the syllable and the letters so that it would become pula or ulap. And so they would see that with just four letters, there could be many meanings and many words. The other thing that I was lucky enough to join were to conduct mothers classes. So all mothers of small children are very interested in helping their children develop. And so by engaging with them about making toys for their children, singing songs, making rhymes, and doing all these activities with their children, we also were able to help them harness their literacy so that these literacies could be used to help their own children develop literacies. Third, participatory programs where families define what their training needs are help in getting families to join these programs. When something is participatory, this is beyond consultative. It is really participatory, because when it is participatory, there's a point where you allow joint decision making, joint direction setting. And these are very important. So when families are able to do that, then they know that what they will learn is important to them and useful for them. So when these programs are created, it's important for us to be able to ensure that families have a say in what the programs will contain. Number four is community rather than school-based literacy programs. You know, sometimes adults don't want to be seen going to school, especially if they're elementary or high schools. They would rather have a little learning center in the barangay or in the community to have adult education classes where they could be with fellow adults and they don't feel like their children going to school. This is an important thing to remember, is that much of what prevents adults from studying again or participating in education programs is that they feel that they are being treated like children. But you see, in community education, what we're trying to do is to create opportunities for them to learn livelihood, additional skills for their present livelihood, or to retrain themselves for new livelihood, while at the same time strengthening their literacy abilities or their language abilities, obviously. It's very important that these are community based, because communities will have a specific kind of livelihood or a direction for their economic growth that might be important to these adults. Alternatively, community programs such as book clubs or choir practice or even dancing lessons, these can be avenues for developing literacy. And so as long as we integrate literacy into these programs, we will create more literacy behaviors in our communities. And when there's higher community literacy behavior, it is very likely that there will be higher family literacy behavior as well. Um, Another possible activity is for communities to document their stories, their experiences, their life, their songs, their poetry, their literature, and to make products, for example, books or maybe an app if there is somebody who is capable of helping them do that, so that they can create content which can be used for the children in their schools. No, this is very important for indigenous communities. It's equally important for us if we are going to promote and continue to push for Filipino as a medium of instruction, as a way of engaging with in higher education, technical education, then it's important for content to be developed in the various languages of the Philippines. It's also important to create materials to read, because why do we read? Why do we learn to read? We learn to read because there's something to read. And something to read is very important, because without materials to read, then the purpose for literacy is diminished. But the books that we create, these immortalize the knowledge and the experiences we have now, so that our our succeeding generations will have a glimpse of what our lives were like, and how we understood the world, and how we appreciated each other or not, right? And so it's very important to have family literacy programs that actually create things. An important add-on to all these programs mentioned is self-efficacy and confidence. If adults are to help their children, then they should also help themselves. And so it's very important to develop this confidence in them. This is particularly important now in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. If adults are not sure how to help their children at home with the subject matter, or with time management, or with the homework or the lessons, then they will feel inadequate. And if they feel inadequate, then they feel they cannot help. Or this concern about worrying whether people are being honest or children are being honest with their schoolwork. I think that we are missing an entire opportunity here to to get families learning together by being so concerned about who's answering the quiz, right? The important thing is to get people to work together in the home so that they all learn. And I think that's the point of view that we must take, not to always question whether there is intellectual dishonesty, but more, let us do it together so we learn together. The family learns together. And therefore, the educational system, as it is adjusting to the demands of the pandemic, this system should now transfer into a family literacy system, a family program for learning. By leveraging family literacy, we also will be able to reach social justice. So this is very important to understand, that literacy is not for literacy's sake, nor is it only for individuals. By recognizing literacy practices in different units or communities, we leverage literacy behavior for social development. We bridge school literacies with family and community literacies. And of course, from family to community to national, we will be able to build these literate communities towards achieving the sustainable development goals that we set out for ourselves. This is a quick look at goal number 4 of the SDGs, that by 2030, that's not far off, that's less than 10 years away, that children are able to access quality primary, secondary, early childhood development education, that all men and women have access to quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, and that there's an increase in participation in employment or entrepreneurship of the youth who have the right skills that will allow them to engage in employment and businesses. We also want to, and 4.6 is very important because it says all youth and a substantial proportion of adults, of men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy. Can you imagine the power of family literacy in achieving the SDG 4.6? If we are able to create programs now during the pandemic and after, that will allow families to interact on education, we will be able to propel literacy levels among individuals to a little bit higher than it was before. And therefore, they're able to learn more about what their community needs for sustainable development and so on. So the other goals are in support of these first 6 goals, which would be upgrading facilities, having scholarships for all of the higher ed and technical ed, and of course, you need very good teachers, quality teachers, to be able to teach children in all the levels and teach adults in adult education and higher education or post-secondary education. And these are important because goal number 4 of the SDGs, I'm sorry, goal number 4.6 of the SDGs is actually a goal that family literacy programs can reach. Finally, just to be very quick, we need more research on family literacy, not only in the Philippines, but everywhere. And many times, these are ethnographic or social linguistic work with families and communities. We need to explore, find out first how families are trying to be literate before telling them how to do it. I think this was the first knee-jerk reaction when the Taylor study came out in 1983. Was based on the Taylor studies, guidelines or programs were developed. But and then these programs were now applied to everybody without consideration of culture. So here in number 4, there's an important point that we must look at the culture and see how the culture defines family literacy. We also need to do a lot of interviews and surveys. We can use cards to show, is this a literacy activity you do? We can show a picture of cards. When you do this, what sort of literacies do you practice? Or if you show them environmental print, like signs in the street, we can ask adults and siblings, how do you use this so that your younger brother or sister learns how to read? So these are things that can be done with clever ways of collecting data. We also need to measure the measures of literacy. For example, if we continue to use only reading, writing, tests to measure literacy, we are missing the part of when are they using it? When is it functional? Um, where would they like to use it? Or their goals? I think that is an important thing to think about. We need to measure the measures and see whether these measures are consistent with the theory of family literacy as we understand it now. In fact, are these measures consistent with the way literacy is being defined now? And this leads us to country studies on literacy. We we are very afraid of these PISA results. We are threatened by it that the Philippines is in the bottom and so on. But this is information about our our state of literacy in relation to the kind of assessment that the PISA gives. And so we need to look at it again while measuring the measures of literacy. We need now to see what can we do so that our students or our children are better able to engage with that kind of measure. But we also need to show the world that we have other measures and our children do particularly well on some of them. They're not bad in everything because that's not possible. So it's very important for us to look at country studies on literacy and also look at studies that investigate other aspects of literacy. And I think when we do this, we can now research on how different cultures, different countries practice family literacy, but also how different cultures and different countries research on family literacy. So these are my references, which you can take a look at later. And I hope that this presentation shows us how we can look at family literacy not only as a phase in the development of literacy among young children, but as a tool by which we can propagate literacy practice and use more across all community types, all family types, so that we can attain higher literacy levels in our country. Thank you.